The press was initially very cooperative with Western foreign policy until around 2003, 2004. It was a regime that relied on the support of the middle class and styled itself as the defenders of the middle class. It was a regime where Putin spoke through surrogates as being a Russian Pinochet, the idea of forcibly modernizing the country towards a more sort of neoliberal direction using the support of the secret services. And the regime today is a regime that bases its support on the underclass, on the working class, on state corporations, and far more on the power of the military and of the secret services. It's a regime that deliberately goes against the interests of the middle class. Indeed, it vilifies the middle class and sort of mocks them as cultural outsiders in the new Russia. It's a regime that takes great domestic succor from being anti-Western and enjoys a lot of international prestige from being anti-Western. And it's a regime that is far more authoritarian and far less free market than it was in the early 2000s. And in fact, Russia's gone through a regime change under Putin over the last few years in redesigning this system.
You called it fragile empire. And how fragile is this empire? You're writing it at a time when the frailties are being exposed, in 2011 particularly. How much, and you also say authoritarianism is weakness, and there's so much more crisis management in the Kremlin than you'll get in the White House. So how fragile is this empire now?
Well, the reason I call the book Fragile Empire is that Putin believes that Russia is incredibly fragile, and animating Putin's vision of his role in history and of his country is that this sort of sprawling imperium is on the verge of breakup unless it can be led by a tough iron hand. And Putin looks at the Russian people as a nation that is sort of full of passion and stampedes very quickly towards where there's fashionable in the West, falls very quickly for sort of con men and charlatans promising a liberal revolution tomorrow, a communist revolution tomorrow, or hucksters, and that needs to be sort of guided and sort of kept in check. And the whole inner discourse of the Kremlin is one that's very frightened of potential fissures between Christians and Muslims, between the Siberian provinces and the European provinces, and very fearful of Russia's own economic sovereignty, of Russia being sort of carved up between Western corporations and Chinese corporations.
Obviously, now that Donald Trump has won in the US, how much of a difference is that going to make in terms of we've seen Russia be involved in this election in a way that for a lot of the West feels terribly frightening? And do you think for Putin, how does Putin see Trump? Is he a kind of useful fool, or what are they building in a relationship, do you think?
Well, Russia's international goals they're very sort of open about these, and Russia believes that a promise was made to Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand into the territories of the former Soviet bloc. It wouldn't expand into Poland, and it certainly wouldn't expand into territories of the former sort of Soviet Union. And starting from the late 90s, there was a sense of betrayal and a sense of blackmail that the West rolled out the expansion of NATO first into sort of Hungary and Poland and the Czech Republic, and then further into the Baltic states that had been part of the Soviet Union. And the second great sense of betrayal was that Russia believed that having dismantled the socialist bloc, it would be handed a sort of vice presidency of a sort of greater white European sort of post-Western world. And there was a sense of fury and shock that this was not awarded to them. And the key turning point there was the Kosovo War. Starting from actually pre-Putin, from the prime ministership of Yevgeny Primakov, who was great Soviet spy master, a man responsible for cultivating such assets as Saddam Hussein or as Abu Mazen in Ramallah. He sketched out a vision that was initially mocked. And this vision was of multipolarity, and that Russia had to break down the American unipolar moment, and it had to cultivate ties to India, had to cultivate ties with Germany, to cultivate ties with China, any state that was sovereign, because Russia doesn't believe that countries like Britain or countries like Bangladesh are actually sovereign. It believes they can't make their own decisions, they live at the whims of others. And that this vision of what our multipolarity would look like involved two core strategic goals. The first was that the territories of the former Soviet empire, the Baltic states, Central Asia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus, should be semi-independent, that this would be a privileged sphere of Russian interests. Even though they were formally independent, these states would not be allowed to make their own foreign policy. That means they would never be allowed to join NATO, they'd never be allowed to join the EU, and Russia would run them behind the scenes through their economy, through spying ties, in a way that France, in a system developed by the General de Gaulle, managed West Africa, sort of through corporations and diamond deals and webs of personal corruption. The second strategic objective that Russia has had consistently since the early 2000s is to replace, undermine, or join NATO. Anything to stop NATO being a democracy-promoting club and a block of guarantees against Russia. And at first, there was a suggestion that NATO should be replaced by a souped-up version of the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is one of the sort of alphabet soup of international organisations that are sort of leftovers from the sort of late 20th century, or a new European security treaty. And a new European security treaty in which Russia would join a version of NATO that would no longer be NATO, because Russia could sort of undermine it and it wouldn't operate in the same way. So Russia's been so consistent with these two objectives. They've given speeches about them. Prime Minister or sort of fake President Medvedev gave various speeches about this in the late 2000s. They even went as far as to design a new European security treaty. There are drafts of it. You can find them on the Kremlin website. And Putin, in his last visit to New York, in his last visit to New York, and in 2015, he gave a speech at the UN Assembly, outlining what he wanted from international affairs. And in this speech, he gave not particularly coded references to the desire for a new Yalta Agreement. And the Yalta Agreement was the agreement at the end of World War II, where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin agreed on spheres of influences, carving up the world into the blocks that we lived through during the Cold War. I lived through for a very brief period, but maybe others lived through for a bit longer in this room. And Putin put forward the suggestion for a new version of the anti-Hitler alliance against ISIS. The idea is that in exchange for the United States abandoning various principles of foreign policy, democracy, human rights, and yes, an anti-colonial principle that states like Ukraine or Belarus or Kyrgyzstan have a right to choose their own foreign policy, a right to choose if they're in the EU or NATO, Russia would team up in a sort of Batman and Robin against international jihadism and indeed international Islamism. And together, sort of the MiGs and the F-16s would pound Libya and Syria, and together young Muslim men would disappear into extraordinary rendition from the slums of Paris or London. And this is something that Russia's been very consistent of, and Russia has been very consistent of in talking to the Trump team, and that's what Russia is going to ask for in the forthcoming sort of Putin-Trump summit. There's nothing secretive about it. All of these objectives are available online for you to read on the Kremlin website. Now, does Russia actually expect that this is going to happen? We don't pay enough attention to what Putin actually says, and Putin has said that he considers Mr. Trump very talented, very interested, and he was very happy to to have him visit sort of Moscow, and that he has also said, and lots of his surrogates have said, that they are sort of concerned that this might not be a particularly predictable regime that's coming into the United States. If you look at what junior ministers or other sort of Kremlin sort of mouthpieces have been saying since the election, there's a lot of skepticism that he can actually deliver. And this is one of these ways that Russia looks at the United States and looks at Britain. Is that Russia has a deep state, the KGB's successor agencies, the FSB and the SVR, and Russian sort of signal intelligence, creating a huge bureaucracy of 6 million people. And this deep state guides foreign policy and has influence over foreign policy, regardless of what various politicians coming and going. And Russia believes that the CIA and the NSA and this whole American deep state, which is a product of the Cold War, it didn't exist before the Cold War, as much as the sort of KGB is a product of the Cold War. And they are very curious to find out to what extent these institutions can stop Trump. They don't know, and it appears that they think that these institutions will put the clamps on Trump, because they don't really believe that these organizations they've been competing with for decades will sort of like close up shop very quickly on sort of NATO, just like that.
And how much influence do you think Putin had over the American elections? I mean, would you go as far, how much did he help Trump?
Well, there are various levels to that question. Like the first is starting throughout the Putin regime in the 2000s. Was like not very remarkable internationally. It marketed itself as an emerging democracy with a firm hand that sort of spun things a little bit around the edges to ensure a good results for the middle class, that was seeking cooperation with the West and didn't want any interference with its domestic affairs. It didn't style itself any different in its outward projection of itself or of its discussion of itself to its citizens. And since Putin's third term as president, since 2012, the Russian regime has gone through a pretty drastic rebranding of itself, branding itself as an alternative pole of values in international affairs. And this was largely mocked by Western analysts, Western diplomats, by sort of the citizens of the world, be they in Moscow or be they in sort of Dakar or London. And the values that Putin started projecting was, this is not going to be a sort of cosmopolitan fusion country. I stand against all of this rubbish, like gay rights, trans bathrooms. I stand for manly virtues. I stand for military values. I stand for a nation state where this is our country and the minorities shut up and behave themselves. And projecting against the sort of visions of globalization, the visions of Davos, what is a pretty conventional sort of 20th century, early 20th century sort of European Christian nationalist movement. And one should not underestimate to what degree that is actually attractive to people. And you have a lot of politicians in France, from Nicolas Sarkozy to François Fillon, who might actually win the primary of Le Droit et le Centre today, who are attracted for it, not because they're paid, not because they are tricked, but because that's actually quite close to their own values. And you have lots of politicians in Central Europe, or indeed in the UK, feel the same. Like one UK politician, Diane James, was saying that how she was very attracted to Mr. Putin. I don't believe that she's paid to, but those values, the values of the ethno-state, undergirded by Christian principles, are close to her own. So with the Trump team and the Trump supporters, that's a huge part of it. Like Donald Trump's values are close to Putin's. So on the second level of influence is the Kremlin over the last 5 or 6 years has been reviving its traditional posture during the Cold War of funding and cultivating ties to anti-systemic political parties across the across the West. We know formally that they fund Le Front National in France, which may well win the presidential election in April, and that would signal the end of the European Union, because it would see France exit. The European Union can live without Britain, it can live without Spain, it can live without Hungary, it can't live without France. And this Russian funding is being linked to anti-European parties in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Hungary, in the Czech Republic, and there have been a lot of contacts that we don't have full information on with groups like the AfD or groups like sort of UKIP and UKIP funders like Arron Banks in the UK. We don't know the full details, but we know that they're meeting often with the Russian embassy. Primarily that's because their values are attractive, but we don't know what else is going on there. Now, with the Trump team, Russia views Trump as something that it's very familiar with, an oligarch, an individual who controls a lot of franchises, not an individual who actually produces anything of value, and an oligarch keen to sort of make his name, an oligarch who's sort of promoting himself on TV. And Trump has been interested in doing business in Russia since the 90s. He's actually failed. He's never managed to do any decent business, the like of which he wanted. Trump wanted to go into building international real estate, never really took off. And one of his targets was Moscow because of Moscow's incredible real estate scene. But Trump has been sort of traveling there frequently over the last few years, and he appears to have had contacts with the Kremlin, probably with Putin himself. Indeed, Trump has said in 2014, 2015, he had a conversation with Putin that they both denied. And when Trump started putting together his initial team, he's put together a team of people who, similarly to him, have been traveling frequently to Moscow. These people have been appearing on Russia Today, the Russian propaganda channel. These are people who have been working or linked with Russian state corporations, and they're all people who believe in this vision of what kind of European white values should be. Now, should we read Trump as a Russian spy? Now, when you talk to Russians about intelligence, Russians will constantly tell you, was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin an agent of German intelligence, or was German intelligence an agent of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin? And just in case you sort of don't know the stories of the October Revolution, is that Lenin returned from exile in Europe to St. Petersburg on a train provided for him by German intelligence, and it's a staple of Russian thinking that that he was not an agent of the German state. The German state actually was turned into his agent. So I think there's also there are several classifications in how Russia treats its people that it has contacts with. There are active agents, and then there are agents of influence. An agent of influence is what we would call in English a useful idiot, and of individuals who think like them, who are keen to do business with them, individuals who are, for whatever reason, travelling on the same path, that can be spun without fully realising it into helping Russian foreign policy objectives. And Donald Trump is clearly operating as a useful idiot. Whether or not it's idiotic for Donald Trump to do that is a completely different question. Whether it clearly wasn't during the campaign. It clearly, it might not be in international affairs. There's a lot that Trump and Russia could do together. Maybe it's the kind of things that I wouldn't like to see him do. Probably most of us in this room wouldn't like to see him do. But there's stuff that's very much available. Then, how did Russia intervene in the elections? What has happened here? It's not the Manchurian candidate. It's not that Trump was recruited and turned into a sort of KGB mole and then sent to sort of destroy the United States. It's that somebody who was around them and close to them, that they helped boost and encourage, just so happened to be on the same the same path. But how do they boost and encourage him? One of the key things to understand about Donald Trump, Barack Obama, and Vladimir Putin is that Obama wasn't the 21st century politician who really understood the internet that he thought he was. And Obama, this intensely arrogant man who actually encouraged Donald Trump to run for president by ridiculing him consistently since 2011. Obama, who guest-edited Wired magazine as Aleppo was being bombed. Obama, who sort of has a Snapchat account, didn't engage at all in thinking and how the internet was really changing the way our societies think and our societies exchange information until it was much too late. And I don't know if any of you have read David Remnick's very sugary profile of the last days of Barack Obama before the shock Trump win in the New Yorker. And the key, most revealing point in this sort of eulogy is that the last 3 days before the result, Obama was obsessed about stories of fake news, stories of how fake news articles got more engagement on Facebook than real news articles, guys in Macedonia like pumping out fake stories like the Pope had endorsed Trump that got over 800,000 shares. All of this stuff is something that Putin started thinking about very early. So the key things to understand about Putin is that this is a politician who had a political near-death experience. And in December 2011, as the so-called Twitter revolutions or Facebook revolutions had just swept the Arab world, a rigged election for the Russian parliament triggered mass protests. And this came out of nowhere for Russian intelligence and for the Kremlin. You had 100,000 people that organized on the street. They dominated Twitter, Facebook sort of organized them, and you had a whole series of politicians who were internet populists. They had no seats in parliament, they had no mass movements, but boom, they managed to get more followers online than all of Russia's sort of main TV stations and national newspapers. And Putin very nearly lost power. He very nearly lost the support of the elite. He very nearly lost legitimacy in the country. And the regime went into a prolonged legitimacy crisis in which his popularity really, really tanked. And Putin looked back at how he'd originally set up his regime. I talked about how there'd been a regime change under the same leader, and realized that he had totally and utterly misunderstood the internet. And when Putin became acting president after being chosen as the successor by Boris Yeltsin, one of the first meetings he had 3 days before assuming the role was to meet with Russia's leading internet entrepreneurs. And he promised these individuals there will be no Vietnam and no China on our internet. He wanted to project himself as a liberal, but also he thought that the internet didn't matter. The FSB was consistently lobbying him, going, the internet matters, it matters, it matters, let us build a Chinese system. Putin went, no, it's not important. Only 1% of the Russian population is online, and half of it is porn. I don't care. It would have been useful for us in the Soviet Union to allow 1% of the population to read whatever it wanted from the West, as we censored TV and we censored newspapers for the masses. And Putin looked at when these protests almost overthrew him and went, I completely misunderstood this. I didn't realize the internet had changed our society profoundly. I don't understand this. And he allowed Russian intelligence to really design a new system for the internet. So what came out of it? Russian trolls, a Russian cyber army, Russian commenters, Russian sort of pro-regime Twitter personalities, YouTube accounts. The budget for Russia Today was massively expanded, and it was a really big success. Why is it a big success? Russia Today became the first YouTube channel to have over 1 billion views. And I just checked yesterday, it had 1.8 billion views. Pretty good for a YouTube channel. And this online cyber force was used within Russia to smack down the opposition and to push the online debate in a pro-regime way. And since that, it's been projected outwards. Offence is the best form of defence. And what we saw was this online information spin be applied to the US election. So how does it mirror what happened to Putin what happened to the crisis that Putin faced in 2011. The most dangerous opponent that Vladimir Putin has faced was a blogger called Alexei Navalny. And Mr. Navalny is somebody, this may sound familiar, is somebody who works with leaks, somebody who publishes on his blog leaked material about corruption in the Russian system. And it's someone who became immensely popular as an online populist, using Twitter, website, kind of blog to expose the corruption of the Russian system. And what the Russian state has done is build up Julian Assange into being the American Navalny. And instead of people within the Russian system leaking information about corruption to Navalny, the Russian state engaged in hacking of all of these different email accounts linked to the Hillary Clinton campaign and then provided them to him. So it's cloning the techniques used against, or Putin felt were used against him. Now, the Russians have Russia has a conceptualization of information warfare. And I think that the key mistakes, to come back to this, that the previous administration made was, firstly, to endlessly talk about Russia as being a 19th century power. Obama repeatedly said he's behaving like it's the 19th century, and I think that that administration exposed its own ignorance there. And the other key error I think that they made was to believe that the deep motors of globalization were on our side. That globalization is a sort of force of nature that will, no matter what, make the world look like America. What Putin understood, and you see this in the Trump election, was realized that in the early 2000s, it appeared in Dakar, it appeared in Belgrade, it appeared in Cairo, Moscow, that globalization was good for the following people. It was good for NGOs, it was good for sort of Bill and Melinda Gates, international whatever, it was good for Democrats, it was good for online activists. But what we've actually seen in the last few years is that globalization is not actually particularly good for these people, and the internet can very easily be weaponized by authoritarians. What globalization is much better for are actually authoritarians. And that if you look at the Putin clique, if you look at the clique who rule Kazakhstan or the clique that rule many countries in Asia, these individuals travel backwards and forwards to the West, and even though on the ground the embassies might go, ooh, terrible, terrible what you're doing, when they go to London or they go to New York or they go to Geneva, they have a lawyer that works for them, a British lawyer, a French banker, a German accountant, a PR artist from the sort of Upper West Side, and they can they can arm themselves with Westerners to then undermine Western institutions. And if you look at the Trump team, you see various authoritarian countries have been weaponizing this kleptocratic tendency of the American elite to their advantage. You have various individuals that were working in consulting linked to Russia. Does that mean they were Russian spies? No. It means that they were simply doing what has become increasingly conventional in London or Washington or Paris, which is to do consulting for international clients, refusing to think who they are or what their money is or what their objective is. And if you look at lots of these individuals, you find that, let's just have a look at recent officials that Trump might appoint to his cabinet. You see that General Mike Flynn was working as a consultant for Turkey. Is he a Turkish spy? No. He was just doing consulting for Turkey and not understanding that his quest for sort of personal enrichment was actually turning him into an agent of Turkish authoritarianism. You see, Rudy Giuliani was working as a consultant for Russian oligarchs. And that's globalization that authoritarians can weaponize. And that's something that Putin understood, that the sort of the weak-headed leaders of the Western world in the last few years failed to recognize and just completely ignored.
And do you think that what Putin has done so cleverly is to spot these weaknesses in the West and exploit them so successfully. I mean, that he realized the problem that Obama couldn't see, as you've said, until 3 days before the election, and he honed in on it. But do you think that's because he was shaped by what had happened to him?
Well, when you speak to the Russian ruling class and you speak to Russian diplomats and Russian sort of ministers, what they repeat is that they are non-ideological people and that they lived in the Soviet Union and everybody believed in the Soviet Union, that Lenin would sleep on Red Square for all time. And these institutions like the State Planning Commission or the Soviet Mars program would be with us for the next century. And then one day they woke up and it was all finished. Everything was forever until it was no more. And this has made them incredibly suspicious of any ideology. It turned the real ideology of modern Russia, the substrata ideology, is cynicism. And it's cynicism and it's suspicion of all ideologies. And when they look at the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, this generation of Western politicians, they see fossilized Brezhnevian ideologues. And one hears a lot over the last 10 years from Russian officials going that you believe your own lies. You believe your own lies, and increasingly a large amount of you repeat it without believing it. And Russian officials look at the European Union as something actually quite similar to the Soviet Union. The euro is unsustainable the way the Soviet economy was unsustainable. The Soviet Union, one of the reasons it broke up was that there was increasing alarm in the Slavic Russian zone about a booming Central Asian Muslim population. And they didn't want to live in a country that, if it still existed today, would be 40% Muslim. And they look at the European Union seeing these ethno-religious, seeing these unsustainable economics, and seeing this sort of dead weight of ideology, of insisting that things are real when they're not. So that's how they look at the European Union. Another way that they look at Britain and at the United States is that these systems are increasingly corrupt. So it's a mistake to think that Russia in the 80s was not corrupt. Russia in the 1990s was corrupt. Actually, behind the scenes, there was already this rot of dodgy KGB sort of companies operating out of Dresden or Mozambique, doing suspicious sort of money laundering and strange deals. And they look at the culture of lobbyists, the culture of hedge funders, the culture of Westerners being willing to launder the money of authoritarians as signs that the system is actually rotting from within, that people don't believe it, that they don't believe these mantras of democracy that they repeat in the ways that in their childhood they repeated mantras of Leninism without believing it. So that's one way that they look at sort of Washington and they look at London. And also they read into the experience of the Iraq, Afghan, Libyan wars as a parallel to their own defeat in Afghanistan, as that big, complicated regimes based on visions of expanding their ideology to the world, be it socialism or be it democracy, are unable to deal with these defeats. So that's one of the ways that they look at us and they see our vulnerabilities. And they look at someone like Obama as encapsulating a lot of these qualities of Gorbachev, being someone who was seeking to revive the system, who didn't quite believe it, who was a great orator, a sort of Cicero of the Republic, unable to tackle things back. However, having seen that Russia looks at the weaknesses within the West, that's not to mean that they don't see huge weaknesses within their own society. Russia has been frantically working to lift Western sanctions placed on its banks, and in particular debt rollover sanctions placed on Russian banks that don't allow its banks to recapitalize. And Western sanctions on Russia have been extremely painful. Like Russia's economy was growing at a BRIC level, growing at an emerging market level, and now it's not growing not growing at all. The Russian economy is shrinking, and Russian real incomes are shrinking, and the quality of life for the Russian middle class is shrinking. And Russia's own counter-sanctions on the West, especially on food and on cheese, have undermined a lot of the consumerism that made Putin popular in the early part of his regime. And one of the reasons that Russia's been so keen to promote this activist, aggressive foreign policy is to have a sort of TV show for the population to justify this. One of these phrases I like to sort of sum it up is when you read sort of Noam Chomsky about America, it's like 15% true. Manufacturing consent, sort of wars as a sort of infotainment for the population. But if you apply it to Russia, which of course Noam Chomsky is incapable of doing, it's about 75% true.
Mm-hmm. I want you to think about Putin as a construct, which is something you talk about in the book, and him coming to power. And there's this wonderful quote you have that he said, "I don't want to be president, I want to be Berezovsky," early in the book. And you talk as well about the videocracy, the telepopulism. And in the West, we have laughed. I mean, in the UK, we get photos of Putin topless, hunting bears or fishing or whatever.
I actually approve of that.
There's a demographic reason that actually having a healthy leader in Russia, a place where men died very young, seems quite... but this alpha male, to us, seemed a bit laughable. But I want you to discuss how this sort of construct, when at first he seemed very grey, and he seemed manipulatable as well by the oligarchs, but of course he showed them very quickly that they had completely misjudged him.
The origins of Vladimir Putin was that this is not a man who ever expected to be Russian president. It's not a man who ever expected to be head of Russian intelligence. It's not a man who ever expected to be head of intelligence in Leningrad. Is that Mr. Putin came from a working class, poorer background in Leningrad. His mother worked as a janitor, and so did his father. These were not people in any way connected to the party aristocracy, and he was for most of his life he was a failure on his own terms. He was labouring in obscurity as a not particularly good, not particularly successful Russian foreign agent who flunked most of his tests within the KGB in terms of allocating him. One of the things I think is the most revealing about Putin is if you look, one of the two tests in the Soviet Union that did their best to map the human soul was the first, obviously, the test to be a cosmonaut, which was not just the test to go to space, but was the test to be a propagandist to your own society. In America, it was exactly the same. And the second most in-depth test was about measuring your reactions if you wanted to serve in Soviet foreign intelligence. And when the KGB did their sort of bulletin on Putin, they concluded that he was not at all vulnerable to drink or women. This was not a problem for Vladimir. But he had a very serious flaw that was much more serious than women or drink, which was a lowered awareness of danger. He was somebody that didn't see danger coming and didn't appreciate how dangerous a situation could be if he went into it, that he was a bit numb. And because of failing this test, he was assigned to a lowly role in Dresden, which is in East Germany. This was not a cool position in the KGB. The cool positions in the KGB for really brilliant agents, like a gentleman like Alexander Lebedev, was London. It was studying the city. It was stealing the secrets of Western banking. It was stealing the secrets of a stealth bomber. A job in India, a job in Bangladesh, a job in China was far more attractive than Dresden. Dresden was the equivalent, as a British diplomat, of being posted to Denmark, of being posted to sort of nearby sort of thing, not a good job. But it was crucially not in the West. It was still in the East. It was still in the shortage economy. And Putin was laboring away in Dresden, believing that this was it, that this job was forever, this world was forever, this sort of Soviet bloc, this Soviet Union was going to continue. And he was deeply traumatized when his life in Dresden consisted of drinking a lot of beer. You may not believe this, but Putin was actually quite overweight until he was in his till he was about 40. Putin did not work out until he was in his 40s. He had a paunch, he had a disastrous frame. Putin was miserable, he was drinking a lot of beer, and he was beating his wife in Dresden, doing this sort of dead-end job for the KGB, and was horrified when, at the switch of a light, he came out of his office one day, and there was a large protest of East Germans, these sort of subdued, repressed people, saying, Russians out, get out, we want to be part of the sort of West Germany. And Putin went into his office and called the authorities and went, what should I do? What do I do? Do we shoot them? Do we leave them there? What do I do? And the headquarters of the KGB in East Germany went, we can't do anything until we get orders from Moscow, and Moscow is silent. And Putin describes this moment of hearing Moscow is silent as the equivalent of having a sort of intellectual stroke. Just couldn't believe that Moscow was silent, that Moscow had disappeared. He spoke about this moment as the equivalent of losing his sense in the world. How could this huge empire just be silent? How could it have disappeared? When returning to St. Petersburg, Putin found himself in such a difficult position financially and economically, with the heroes of the Soviet Union, the KGB, suddenly being the villains of the new Russia, that he even contemplated working as a taxi driver. So the series of events that lifted Putin to the presidency were pretty dramatic and very unexpected. And one of the characteristics that Putin has really shown in his regime is the ability to learn and the ability to change. And if you look at the first appearances of Vladimir Putin in 1999 on TV, his successorship having been arranged, and a whole Byzantine sort of corrupt gamble by various oligarchs to have this sort of nothing on the throne that they could manipulate. Vladimir Putin on TV looked like he was about to be sick. Like he was green, timid, unable to project himself. Like he really looked like sort of Adrian Mole, plucked out of obscurity and told he had to sort of now deal with the crisis of the Russian state. And Putin that we see now was not a natural thing. It was created and constructed by a whole series of PR advisors and consultants that said that in order to be an effective authoritarian leader in the sort of 21st century that was just beginning, you had to conquer TV. Now, of course a politician has to conquer TV. What? We know this. We know this in South Asia. We know this in Britain. Well, now, TV politicians actually didn't exist in the Soviet Union. Stalin never appeared on TV. He only appeared on the radio. Stalin existed for most people in the Soviet Union as a poster. They have no idea what Stalin's voice was like. Stalin had such a thick Georgian accent, he didn't like appearing on the radio. Sort of Khrushchev was hardly a master of TV. In fact, he was an embarrassment. A sort of peasant banging issue. He radiated no authority on TV. Brezhnev, sort of senile, vegetative lump, inspired no courage and confidence of the Soviet population. And most Russians actually remember these sort of tragic Christmas addresses of Mr. Brezhnev, sort of mumbling, flicking his fingers, going, "Where's my boy?" to give him the information to read out. And Yeltsin, very briefly in the early 90s, Yeltsin was this great sort of populist, this real sort of out-of-control Boris. We know this from England, the ability to sort of summon crowds and to speak, and he was actually quite good looking. But Boris Yeltsin turned out to be one of the worst performers on TV in the 1990s, full stop. Sort of burping, drunk, passing out, visibly destroyed and frightened at the helm of what he'd done. So what Putin did, and what he understood, was that to rule Russia, you had to rule TV. So what Putin is, in that arc of Russia's relationship with TV, is the equivalent of Kennedy in the United States. The reason that we remember Kennedy, the reason that we're even fond of this politician, who achieved nothing apart from involving America in the Vietnam War, is that he was a brilliant TV performer. He took Hollywood to the White House. Previous performers, they were simply not there. And in order to do this, Putin employed a whole series of PR agents that said that the key element that he had to do to distinguish himself from his predecessors was youth and health. Youth, health, virility, and an ever-changing image. That he shouldn't just be Brezhnev, just in the chair. That's it, that's one role. He shouldn't just be Yeltsin, sort of in the same grey suits, kind of slightly overflowing belly and tie at the side. That he had to be the people's friend. He had to be the soldier, the sailor, the spy, the hunter. And this embrace of telepopulism is one of the key characteristics of Putin. And in a way, Putin prefigures a lot of the telepopulism we've seen in in the West since. Somebody who understood that being a TV performer matters, is the key ability to sort of control the public. And this was a very painful process for Putin to learn how to do this. And it took him many years to really assume that role. How did he learn? How did he assume that role? How has Putin been able to jump through all these hoops? Well, the answer is that Putin thinks that Russia is a fragile empire, and Putin is terrified of what will happen to him or what will happen to the country if he loses control. And Putin lives in deep fear of Russia disintegrating into a sort of war of all oligarchs against all oligarchs, and of Russia's ethno-regions breaking away into chaotic rebellions, or of Russia losing its sovereignty and being plundered by Chinese settlers here and corporations in Siberia, or Western corporations buying up its pipelines. So I think that's one of the key things to understand about Putin.
Can I open up to questions on the floor? You straight away. Yeah. Oh, hang on. Sorry.
Yeah. My question is to you that as the recent U.S. presidential election has recently finished, so we see a monolithical societies emerging, because the blue collar have been deprived of all the Western democracies that prides itself on liberalism and other things, that it has deprived. People feel that that the globalization have left them behind. So they are voting from these Christian parties or more right-wing parties. So they feel more brotherlyhood to Putin and other things. So do you think that this phenomenon can lead to the things that occurred with Russia in 1990s? And can the Middle East conflict, like the Syrian conflict, can lead to U.S. disintegration like Russia faced in 1990s?
Well, one of the similarities between the U.S. and between Russia that I've been thinking about over the last couple of weeks is the collapse of the Soviet Union was not just the vanishing of a territory on the map. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the collapse of Soviet industry. And the collapse of Soviet industry spilled over into the collapse of the family. The collapse of the family spilled over into the collapse of male identity, which spilled over into epidemics of alcoholism, HIV, family breakdown, collapse of the nuclear unit. The collapse of Soviet industry, in fact, created a multi-faceted social plague that saw collapse in collapse in Russian male life expectancies of quite a dramatic level, losing 9 years. Now, writing about Russia, it's very obvious that the crisis of deindustrialization created this social crisis that led to this desire, this longing for a strong man to sort of make Russia great again. And looking at the United States, one finds, if one looks at the data about the United States, that the scale of its success, the success of the coast, the success of America's ethnic minorities, which are amazingly successful in many dimensions, and the increasing success of Black America and Hispanic America has obscured that in this belt where one saw the Trump surge, there are very similar qualities, where the collapse of the American factory has spilled over into the collapse of the factory, the collapse of male identity, and one is seeing a lot of similar demographic characteristics. One characteristic which historians will dwell on when they discuss at length the rise of the Donald is that white life expectancy in the United States is falling. If one zooms it into the post-industrial Trump belt, declining very fast. That white family structure in this belt is disintegrating. And one key fact, a fact that may shock people in a more traditional society, is that the percentage of American children that have lived in a family home with more than 3 dads, so more than 3, so at least 4. In France, that is 0.5%. In the highest country in Europe, which is Denmark, it's 2.7%. In the US, it's 8.2%. And that's the figure as a whole. It's not zooming in to the deindustrialized working class. The question that I'm thinking about is actually, I guess that the great mistake of the Blairs and the Clintons and the Yeltsins was to think that deindustrialization would actually be something easy. And that deindustrialization is actually turning into this really damaging process for Western society, for Western or sort of greater European society.
Can we go to another question?
Hi, good morning. So one of the things that you said that really resonated here was when you focused on the fact that Russia, as we know it, and Putin, as we know him, is largely a product of a lot of construction from people in the Kremlin and outside of it.
Yes.
So specifically, after the 2011 parliamentarian crisis, where Putin is so close to losing power, he underwent a radical reconstruction of his public persona. So he suddenly becomes this, as she said, alpha male that appeals to a different sort of hegemonic masculine idea inside of Russia. Yeah. My question was, how do you think that, well, first, do you think that Putin internalizes this new image of him, or is this something that he uses as a tool? And secondly, what has this reconceptualization of the male in Russia and the public persona of politicians in Russia meant for the male population as well as the nationalism inside of Russia currently?
I don't know to what degree that Putin is internalizing this. One can only guess, because I'm not in his head. It appears that he has internalized from what my sources say and from what he says, he's actually very self-pitying. Feels that he was compelled to do this, that he was forced to bear the cross of Russia, that he was forced to do this and to do these crimes, and that people don't appreciate what he's done for the country. They don't appreciate the economic boom. They don't appreciate the stability. They don't appreciate the foreign policy achievements. They don't appreciate how vulnerable, how fragile Russia is and why he has to be there. And that seems to me like quite a classic dictatorial thought process to justify one's continuing rule. When he was, the only time he's ever been pressed, or I guess trapped into answering why he decided to return for that third presidential term, he gave some sort of very incoherent answer about the financial crisis and that only he was able to do it. And he's, I think that is definitely internalized. How has Russian male behavior changed? Not very much. I think that with Trump and with Putin, these things are a lot more distant in the minds and the lives of normal people than the political class and sort of obsessives like me realise. One aspect of the Putin regime and this new turn that has changed relations in Russia is the Putin regime has had a headlong embrace of homophobia as state policy, and propaganda against gays is a staple. And something that I think is a disaster for the country is that, let's face it, NATO is not Russia's real enemy. NATO is not going to come and hurt people in Ekaterinburg. Like, Russia's real enemies are HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis. And Putin, by closing down all discussion of gay life in the Russian education system, in the context of an AIDS epidemic, has passed a death sentence for a generation of young Russian gay men. And the spiraling AIDS epidemic in Russia is a very serious problem that Putin is in complete denial about, in the way that he was in denial about the internet. Sort of says, oh, these people are all homosexuals and prostitutes, I don't care about them, we don't need them. And that's obviously completely ignorant about how diseases function.
Next question, thank you.
First of all, I want to thank to the speakers as well as the audiences also. I'm an optimist man. Let's start with the hope. I think after many decades of enmity between two countries, USA and Russia, they will be reaching into an amicable conditions. My question is, while these two countries will be conversed, will they provide enough food to the hungry people who are living in Africa as well as across in the world? First. Second, how much possibility to do it up to those countries to do it so? Secondly, we saw Russia has broken into pieces. I mean, USSR has been broken into pieces. Will Mr. Putin will try to do it? As we heard, California wanted to outside of the USA.
But so why does Russia not have an aid program? And why is Russia not meaningfully sharing its wealth with the world? Well, it is actually quite shocking that Russia doesn't have a meaningful aid program. And, there are very few countries, even within the former Soviet Union, that receive genuine Russian aid, such as Tajikistan. And this comes from a very deep sense that's not just held by Putin, but collectively held by the population, that they lived in hunger during the Soviet Union as they were feeding the third world, and that they were sending all of their food to socialist countries in Africa and to Cuba, and they squandered their wealth and they squandered their own chance for development on this messianic crusade. Now, I've talked a lot about how Russia is confrontational with the West. But one of the things that you need to understand is the Russian elite believes that it's not confrontational with the West. And if you meet them, they'll go, all we want is for you to treat us like China. Give us a sphere of influence, leave us alone, let us have our imperium, let us buy up chunks of your countries and play international politics the way it is. Let's have the concert of power in Europe. And in exchange, you have a non-messianic Russia. We are not attempting to convert the world to the red flag. We're not attempting world revolution. We're just trying to be normal, just like you.
I think we're probably finished time-wise. So can I just say...
one more here,
how are we doing on time?
A quick one.
Yeah,
Okay,
quick
question and quick
it's
answer.
actually related to what you just said.
Yes, sir.
Because you're talking about, on the other hand, Russia's funding anti-systemic
Yeah.
processes. Continuity with Cold War policies or not? And you said Batman and Robin against ISIS. Which one is Russia, Batman or Robin?
That's a good question.
Well, like Batman as a movie, always had these like very sinister, fascistic undertones of this billionaire who just comes out of his tower to clean up the society. The politicians are incapable. And I think that Trump clearly thinks he's Batman.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And can we put our hands together for Ben?